Every night, a small puppy curled up outside the town hospital's doors, braving the cold and the darkness. It wasn't until Dr. Thomas noticed and uncovered the truth behind the puppy's behavior that he was moved to tears. What could have driven such loyalty and pain in this little creature? On a frosty winter evening, the hospital's golden lights cast a warm glow that reflected off the icy pavement. Patients and visitors rushed in and out, bundled up in coats and scarves, but there was one figure who stood out amidst the bustling crowd, a small puppy with matted fur and tired eyes. He lay curled up just outside the revolving doors. Despite the bitter cold, the dog didn't seek warmth or food. He stayed, his gaze fixed intently on the entrance, as though waiting for someone. Dr. Thomas Walker, a senior pediatrician known for being all work and no nonsense, noticed the puppy for the first time that evening as he exited the hospital. The dog's unwavering gaze stopped him in his tracks. "What's he doing here?" Thomas muttered under his breath, tightening his scarf. A nurse passing by overheard him. "He's been here every evening for weeks, Dr. Walker. Poor thing must be waiting for someone inside." Thomas frowned. Someone inside? His gaze lingered on the small creature, a pang of sympathy breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. The dog's eyes seemed to tell a story, one of loss or longing, a story Thomas couldn't yet understand. The following evening, as Dr. Walker exited the hospital again, his mind was heavy with overdue reports and a busy schedule for the next day. But there, in the exact same spot, was the puppy. Snow had begun to fall, tiny flakes sticking to his fur, but the dog remained still, never taking his eyes off the entrance. Thomas hesitated. He wasn't an animal lover, nor did he have time to be, but something about this dog tugged at his heart. He walked over cautiously, crouching down a few feet away. "You're still here, huh?" he said softly, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. The puppy lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching, but didn't move closer. His eyes, deep pools of emotion, met Thomas's. The doctor felt a lump rise in his throat, an unfamiliar surge of emotion swelling within him. "Do you have an owner?" Thomas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Of course, the dog didn't respond, but his eyes seemed to say everything. The janitor from the previous night strolled by with a broom in hand. "You talking to that mutt again, Doc?" he teased. "That dog's been here for weeks. Some folks say he's waiting for someone. A patient, maybe." Thomas glanced back at the hospital. The thought gnawed at him. Was the puppy's owner inside, lying in one of the sterile hospital beds? Or worse, had they already passed, leaving this loyal companion behind? Over the next few nights, Thomas began to notice the puppy more and more. Each evening, as he left the hospital, the dog was there. He never barked, never begged. He just sat quietly, watching. Thomas found himself lingering at the entrance longer than usual, trying to piece together the mystery. One particularly cold evening, unable to bear the sight of the shivering pup, Thomas went to his car and brought back a small blanket. "Here, this should help," he said, gently draping it over the dog. To his surprise, the puppy allowed it. His big, trusting eyes briefly met Thomas's before he turned back to stare at the hospital doors. That night, Thomas couldn't sleep. The image of the lonely dog haunted him. Was he neglecting someone in need? His job was to save lives, to provide care. But there was a life outside his hospital, seemingly slipping through the cracks. The next morning, Thomas made a decision. During his lunch break, he asked the receptionist at the front desk if anyone had reported a missing dog. "Not that I know of," she replied, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "You think he belongs to a patient?" Thomas asked, his mind racing. "Let me know if anyone asks about him," he added. By the end of the week, Thomas's curiosity had transformed into quiet determination. Each night, he started leaving food and water for the puppy, noticing with satisfaction that the bowls were always empty by morning. But despite his efforts, the dog remained distant, his loyalty tied to the hospital's doors. One evening, as Thomas sat in his car preparing to drive home, he saw the puppy again, curled up in his usual spot. The doctor sighed, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Why won't you leave?" he muttered to himself. The question wasn't born out of frustration, but from a growing sense of helplessness. He felt like he was failing this tiny creature, who seemed to be waiting for something, or someone, that Thomas couldn't provide. It wasn't until the following weekend that Thomas's routine was broken. As he approached the hospital's entrance, he noticed a group of nurses huddled near the dog. One of them, a kind-hearted woman named Sarah, was gently stroking the puppy's head. "He finally let someone touch him," she said, smiling as Thomas approached. "It's like he's starting to trust us." Thomas knelt down, his hand hovering just above the dog's fur. "Is that true, buddy?" he asked softly. "Are you warming up to us slowly?" He reached out, his fingers brushing against the soft, matted coat. The puppy didn't pull away. Instead, he looked up at Thomas, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. In that moment, Thomas knew he couldn't ignore the dog any longer. He had to uncover the truth. Why was this little soul so devoted to the hospital, and what or who was he waiting for? The next morning, Dr. Walker arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. He had spent most of the night thinking about the puppy. Who was this dog waiting for, and why couldn't he shake the feeling that it wasn't just loyalty at play here? It was something deeper. He stopped by the reception desk again. "Any updates on a missing dog?" he asked, hoping for a breakthrough. The receptionist shook her head. "Sorry, Dr. Walker. No reports, no inquiries. It's like he just showed up and made this place his home." Thomas sighed, glancing toward the hospital entrance, where he knew the dog would be. The idea of leaving the mystery unsolved gnawed at him. After his morning rounds, he decided to take a more proactive step. He approached Sarah, the nurse who had connected with the dog the night before. "Sarah," he began, his tone resolute, "I think we need to do more. That dog isn't here by accident." Sarah tilted her head. "You really care about him, don't you?" Thomas hesitated, but then nodded. "It's hard to explain. There's something about him. I feel like we're missing something important." Sarah smiled. "Well, I have a friend at the animal shelter. Maybe they can help us check if he's chipped." "That's a start," Thomas agreed. "Let's do it." That evening, Sarah brought a leash and coaxed the dog into letting her slip it on. To everyone's surprise, the puppy followed without resistance, his small frame trembling slightly as they led him inside. Thomas felt a pang of guilt watching the dog's nervous movements. He didn't want to scare him, but this was necessary. At the shelter, the staff scanned the dog for a microchip. "Nothing," the technician said, frowning. "He's not registered anywhere." Thomas clenched his jaw. "So, what now?" "We could post his picture online," Sarah suggested. "See if anyone recognizes him." The shelter staff agreed, snapping a photo of the dog and posting it to local community boards and social media. "If he has an owner, they'll see this," the technician assured them. Thomas nodded, but deep down he wasn't convinced. If the dog had an owner, why had no one come looking for him all this time? The following days brought no answers, and Thomas grew increasingly attached to the little dog. Though he hadn't brought him home, he found himself spending more time outside the hospital with him. The dog's quiet presence was oddly comforting, a stark contrast to the constant chaos of the pediatric ward. One evening, as Thomas sat on the steps beside the dog, he spoke aloud, his voice soft and contemplative. "You know, I never really thought much about loyalty until I met you. My job. It's all about routine, fixing things, moving on." "But you're different," Thomas murmured. "You're staying here no matter what." The dog tilted his head slightly, as if listening. Thomas chuckled. "You're a better listener than most of my colleagues." The humor quickly faded as he gazed into the puppy's eyes, which seemed to hold a depth of sadness and hope that Thomas couldn't ignore. "Who are you waiting for?" he whispered. The mystery deepened the next day when Thomas overheard a conversation between two elderly patients in the waiting area. "That dog reminds me of a story I heard," one of them said, her voice low and thoughtful. "About a dog that waited for his owner outside a train station for years after he passed away." Thomas froze. Could that be the case here? Had the dog's owner died, leaving him with nowhere to go? The thought sent a chill through him. Determined to find out more, Thomas asked Sarah for help in checking patient records. "I know it's a long shot," he admitted, "but what if the dog's owner was admitted here and never made it out?" Sarah hesitated. "That's a sensitive area, Thomas, but I can see how much this means to you. Let's see what we can find." They spent hours combing through the records from the past month, searching for any patients whose timeline might match the dog's arrival. Finally, Sarah gasped. "Thomas, look at this." She pointed to the file of an elderly man named Edward Langley. He had been admitted 3 weeks earlier after a heart attack and passed away shortly after. "He lived alone," Sarah said, scanning the notes. "No next of kin." Thomas's stomach sank. Could this be it? Was the dog his? "It's possible," Sarah replied somberly. "But how would the dog have known to come here?" Thomas shook his head. "I don't know, but I think we need to look into this more." That evening, Thomas found himself sitting on the hospital steps again, the dog curled up beside him. "Edward Langley," Thomas murmured, testing the name. The dog's ears twitched slightly, and Thomas's breath caught. Was that it? Was he your person? The dog didn't move, but his eyes seemed to soften, almost as if acknowledging the name. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. "If that's true, then I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm sorry you lost him." For the first time, Thomas reached out and stroked the dog's fur, his movements gentle and careful. The puppy leaned into the touch, and Thomas felt an unexpected warmth spread through his chest. "You're not alone any more," he said quietly. "I'll make sure of that." Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the name Edward Langley. If the dog truly belonged to him, there had to be more to the story. Driven by a mix of curiosity and determination, he decided to visit Edward's listed address, hoping to find clues about the bond between the man and the dog. The house was a modest, single-story home at the edge of town. The garden was overgrown, and the paint was peeling from the shutters, but it still radiated warmth, as though it had been loved once. Thomas hesitated at the door, unsure of what to expect. After a moment, he knocked. No answer. He tried the handle and found it locked. Feeling a bit awkward, he stepped back and scanned the area. A neighbor, watering her plants nearby, noticed him. "Can I help you?" she called, her voice cautious. Thomas raised a hand in greeting. "Hi, I'm Dr. Walker. I work at the hospital where Edward Langley was admitted. I've been trying to learn more about him." The woman lowered her watering can, her expression softening. "Edward? Oh, bless his soul. Such a kind man, always kept to himself, but you'd never meet anyone more loyal. Did he have a dog?" Thomas asked. The woman's face brightened. "Oh, yes. A little one, brown, with the sweetest eyes. That dog followed Edward everywhere. You wouldn't see one without the other. Thomas's heart sank. Do you know what happened to the dog after Edward passed? She frowned, wiping her hands on her apron. I assumed he ran off. Poor thing must have been heartbroken. Thomas glanced toward the hospital, visible in the distance. He's been waiting outside the hospital for weeks. The woman gasped. He's still there? Oh, that dog loved Edward more than anything. If he's there, it's because he doesn't know Edward's gone. He's probably waiting for him to come back. Back at the hospital, Thomas shared the revelation with Sarah. It all makes sense now, he said, pacing the break room. The dog's loyalty wasn't random. He's grieving. Sarah nodded, her expression somber. But what do we do now? He can't stay outside forever. I don't know yet, Thomas admitted, but I feel responsible for him. Edward's gone, and there's no one else. Maybe I can take him in. Sarah gave him a small smile. You've grown attached, haven't you? Thomas sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I have. He's been through so much. I can't just leave him like this. That evening, Thomas approached the dog with a leash and a soft voice. Hey, buddy, he murmured. How about coming with me for a while? I'll take care of you. The dog hesitated, his tail wagging uncertainly, but slowly allowed Thomas to slip the leash over his neck. For the first time, the little dog followed him willingly, not to a shelter, but to Thomas's car. At home, Thomas set up a cozy bed in the corner of his living room and filled a bowl with fresh food and water. The dog sniffed around cautiously before settling into his new spot. It's not the hospital, Thomas said softly, crouching beside him, but I hope you'll feel safe here. Over the next few days, the dog began to adjust. He followed Thomas from room to room, his trust growing with each passing moment. Thomas couldn't help but feel a deep sense of connection with the little creature. For the first time in years, his home felt less empty. But the peace didn't last. One evening, as Thomas was finishing dinner, he noticed the dog sitting by the door, his tail wagging anxiously. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, setting down his fork. The dog whined softly, pawing at the door. Thomas frowned, opening it to let him into the yard. Instead of wandering off, the dog turned and looked at him, his eyes pleading. Then he darted toward the street, stopping to look back as though urging Thomas to follow. Confused but intrigued, Thomas grabbed his coat and followed the dog down the quiet street. The little dog led him through winding alleys and across intersections until they arrived at a park on the outskirts of town. "What are we doing here?" Thomas asked, his breath visible in the chilly night air. The dog barked softly and trotted ahead. Thomas followed him to a secluded bench under a street lamp. There, sitting on the bench, was an envelope with the name Edward Langley scrawled across the front. Thomas's heart raced as he picked it up. Inside was a handwritten letter, the ink smudged in places but still legible. The opening words sent chills down his spine. "My dearest companion, if you're reading this, it means I've left this world, but I need you to know how much you meant to me." Thomas read the letter aloud, his voice trembling. It was a heartfelt message from Edward, written as though he was speaking directly to his beloved dog. It spoke of gratitude, love, and a wish for the dog to find happiness, even in his absence. By the time Thomas finished reading, tears were streaming down his face. The little dog sat quietly beside him, his head resting on Thomas's knee, as if he, too, understood the weight of the words. "Edward loved you so much," Thomas whispered, stroking the dog's fur. "And now, I promise to honor that love." The discovery of Edward's letter weighed heavily on Thomas's mind as he drove home. The little dog curled up in the passenger seat beside him. The letter confirmed what Thomas had already suspected. This dog was more than just a stray. He had been someone's entire world, and now he was left behind, searching for answers that he might never find. Back at the house, Thomas placed the letter carefully on his kitchen counter. He brewed a cup of tea, needing something to calm the swirl of emotions inside him. The dog sat by his feet, his tail thumping softly against the floor. "You really are incredible, aren't you?" Thomas said, reaching down to scratch behind the dog's ears. "I don't think I've ever met anyone as loyal as you." The dog tilted his head as if listening and let out a soft whine. Thomas chuckled. Okay, I get it. You're hungry." He filled the dog's bowl with food and sat beside him while he ate. The rhythmic crunching was oddly comforting. As the days went by, Thomas noticed a change in himself. He had always been dedicated to his work. For the first time, Thomas felt a sense of purpose beyond his work at the hospital. Taking care of Max brought a new rhythm to his life. Morning walks, shared meals, and quiet evenings together on the couch. Before long, Thomas had started calling him Max, a name that seemed to fit the little dog's brave and steadfast nature. But Max's adjustment to this new life wasn't without its challenges. Though he had grown attached to Thomas, there were moments when his loyalty to Edward resurfaced. Some evenings, Max would sit by the door, staring out into the darkness, waiting for someone who would never return. Other times, he'd bark at the sound of a passing car, his ears perking up hopefully before drooping in disappointment. One night, as Thomas worked on paperwork at the kitchen table, he noticed Max pacing restlessly. "What's wrong, buddy?" Thomas asked, setting down his pen. Max barked once and trotted over to the counter where Edward's letter lay. He paused at the edge of the counter, looking up at Thomas with pleading eyes. "You miss him, don't you?" Thomas whispered, kneeling beside Max. "I can't bring Edward back, but I promise I'll do everything I can to make you happy." Max licked Thomas's hand, his tail wagging faintly. Thomas took this as a sign of trust, a fragile but growing bond between them. Meanwhile, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Edward's story. The letter, though heartfelt, hinted at a deeper struggle. Why had Edward been in the hospital? What had happened in the days leading up to his passing? The questions gnawed at Thomas, urging him to dig deeper. He returned to the hospital and reviewed Edward's file. It revealed that Edward had been battling a terminal illness for months, something he had kept hidden from nearly everyone. His final days had been spent in solitude, with Max as his only companion and comfort. The realization hit Thomas hard. Edward hadn't just loved Max. He had relied on him in a world that had become increasingly lonely. Max had been Edward's one constant. Thomas shared his findings with Sarah, who listened intently. "It's heartbreaking," she said, shaking her head, "but it makes sense now. That dog wasn't just loyal. He was grieving." Thomas nodded. "I want to do something for Edward, for Max. They both deserve better than what happened." Sarah smiled softly. "You already are, Thomas. You're giving Max a new chance at life, and I think Edward would have wanted that." Inspired, Thomas decided to honor Edward's memory in a tangible way. He reached out to the neighbor who had spoken so fondly of Edward and asked for her help. Together, they planned a small memorial service in Edward's favorite park. Word spread quickly, and soon other neighbors and acquaintances who had known Edward began offering to contribute, bringing flowers, sharing stories, and even donating to a local animal shelter in his name. On the day of the memorial, Thomas brought Max to the park. The little dog seemed to sense the significance of the gathering, sitting quietly by Thomas's side as people shared their memories of Edward. Some spoke of his kindness, others of his quiet strength, and many mentioned Max, noting how inseparable the two had been. When it was Thomas's turn to speak, He held Edward's letter in his hand. "Edward may no longer be with us," he began, his voice steady despite the emotions swelling in his chest, "but his love and loyalty live on in Max. This little dog is a testament to the kind of man Edward was, someone who gave everything he had, even in his final days." The crowd murmured in agreement, and a wave of warmth washed over Thomas as he looked down at Max. "I promised to take care of him," Thomas continued, his voice firm, "to honor Edward's memory by giving Max the life he deserves." As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Thomas felt a profound sense of closure. The memorial had not only honored Edward, but it had also deepened his connection to Max. For the first time, Max seemed truly at ease, resting his head on Thomas's lap as they watched the crowd disperse. That night, back at home, Thomas tucked Edward's letter into a frame and placed it on the mantel above the fireplace. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a symbol of the bond between a man and his dog, and the legacy of love they had left behind. With the memorial behind them, Thomas felt a renewed sense of responsibility for Max. The little dog had become an integral part of his life, and their bond grew stronger with each passing day. Yet, as comforting as Max's presence was, there was a lingering question Thomas couldn't shake. Why had Edward left Max at the hospital, rather than arranging for someone to take care of him directly? The mystery lingered in the back of Thomas's mind, growing more insistent as he pieced together Edward's story. One evening, as Thomas sat on the couch with Max curled up beside him, he decided to dig deeper. Edward's neighbor had mentioned a sister, someone Edward had been estranged from for years. If anyone had more insight into Edward's final days, it would be her. The next day, Thomas tracked down Edward's sister, Clara, using the hospital records and information from the neighbor. He found her living in a modest home on the outskirts of the city. With Max by his side, Thomas approached the front door and knocked. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a woman in her late 50s with tired eyes and a wary expression. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. "Miss Clara," Thomas said, "my name is Thomas. I'm a doctor at the hospital where your brother Edward passed away." He hesitated, unsure of how to broach the subject. "I've been taking care of his dog, Max, and I wanted to learn more about Edward's final days." Clara's eyes softened at the mention of Max, she whispered, her voice tinged with emotion. "I haven't seen that little dog since Edward fell ill. Please, come in." Inside, Clara explained the fractured relationship she had had with her brother. They had grown apart over the years due to a misunderstanding about their parents' inheritance. Edward had always been stubborn, and Clara admitted that her pride had kept her from reaching out to mend things. "When I heard he was sick," she said, her voice trembling, "I thought about visiting, but I didn't know how he'd react. I didn't want to make things worse." Thomas listened carefully, noting the regret in Clara's voice. "He spoke about you in his letter," he offered gently. "He was clear. He cared about you, even if things were complicated." Clara's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to pat Max's head. "I should have been there for him," she murmured, "and for Max, Edward loved this little dog more than anything." The conversation took an unexpected turn when Clara revealed something Thomas hadn't known. Edward had been trying to reconcile with her in his final months. He had left messages, sent letters, and even attempted to visit her home. "But I was too afraid to answer," Clara admitted, her voice trembling. "I thought it was too late." Hearing this, Thomas felt a surge of determination. "It's not too late to honor his memory," he said firmly. "You can help me take care of Max and ensure Edward's story isn't forgotten." Clara nodded, her resolve strengthening. "I want to make things right, for Edward and for Mac." As Clara and Thomas began to collaborate on their mission, new challenges emerged. Clara suggested visiting Edward's old home to retrieve any belongings he might have left behind for Max. The house had been locked up since Edward's hospitalization, and the thought of going through his things was daunting for both of them. Yet, they agreed it was necessary. The visit to Edward's home was an emotional one. The small, cluttered house was filled with memories of a man who had lived simply, but deeply. Max immediately recognized the space, wagging his tail excitedly as he sniffed around the living room. In the corner of the room, Clara found a worn blanket that Max seemed particularly drawn to. Clara folded it carefully, her hands trembling as she did so. Near the kitchen, Thomas discovered a box filled with photographs and letters. Among them was a journal Edward had kept during his illness. Flipping through its pages, Thomas was struck by the depth of Edward's love for Max. One entry read, "This dog saved me. He gave me a reason to keep going, even when everything felt hopeless." The journal also revealed something unexpected. Edward had been planning to set up a fund for local animal shelters, a way to give back to the creatures that had brought him so much comfort. Unfortunately, his illness had progressed too quickly for him to finalize the details. Thomas shared this discovery with Clara, who immediately latched onto the idea. "We have to make this happen," she said firmly. "It's what Edward would have wanted." Turning Edward's dream into reality wasn't easy. Thomas and Clara began reaching out to local shelters and organizations, pitching the idea of a memorial fund in Edward's name. They encountered resistance at first. Some shelters were skeptical, and others lacked the resources to participate. But Thomas's passion for the project eventually won people over. Max became the face of their campaign. His loyalty and resilience inspired everyone who heard his story. A photo of Max sitting beside Edward's framed letter became the centerpiece of their promotional materials, and soon donations began to pour in, from neighbors, hospital staff, and even strangers who had heard about Edward's story. As the fund grew, Thomas noticed a change in Clara. The guilt and sadness that had once consumed her began to lift, replaced by a sense of purpose. She started volunteering at a local shelter, spending time with dogs who reminded her of Max. Thomas, too, felt a renewed sense of fulfillment. Balancing his work at the hospital with his efforts for the fund wasn't easy, but every time he saw Max wagging his tail or received a thank-you note from a shelter, he knew it was worth it. As the memorial fund for Edward's legacy gained momentum, Thomas and Clara found themselves working more closely together. Their shared mission to honor Edward brought them a sense of healing, but it also exposed deep-seated emotions and unresolved regrets that neither had anticipated. One afternoon, Thomas invited Clara to visit the hospital where Edward had spent his final days. He believed it would help her connect with the brother she had lost and give her closure. Clara hesitated at first, visibly uneasy. "I don't know if I can face it," she admitted, her voice trembling. "You don't have to do this alone," Thomas reassured her. "Max and I will be right there with you." Clara looked at Max, who wagged his tail enthusiastically as if encouraging her to take the step. She nodded, her resolve firming. "Okay, let's do it." At the hospital, Thomas led Clara to the ward where Edward had been treated. The sterile halls and faint smell of antiseptic brought back a flood of memories for Thomas, but he focused on Clara, whose eyes darted around nervously. They stopped outside the room where Edward had stayed. "This is it," Thomas said softly, gesturing to the door. Clara hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. "What if I can't do this?" she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. Thomas placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Take your time. Edward would understand." With a deep breath, Clara pushed the door open. The room was empty. The note that had appeared under the door left a chill in Thomas's bones. "Max doesn't belong to you." He felt a sense of dread ripple through him as he showed the note to Clara, his voice tinged with concern. "What do you think this means?" Clara's expression darkened, her brow furrowing with worry. "Do you think someone's claiming to have a connection to Max?" Maybe they think he's valuable because of the publicity. Thomas couldn't shake the growing unease that settled over him. The idea that someone might want Max for reasons other than love or care was terrifying, especially given all the attention the little dog had garnered. Clara was equally worried, though she tried to remain composed. After a tense silence, Thomas nodded. "I think we need to take this seriously. We can't let Max fall into the wrong hands." They decided to install security cameras around the shelter, hoping to deter any potential threats. They also notified the local authorities about the strange note and the possibility of someone trying to claim Max as their own. The days that followed were filled with vigilance. Thomas and Clara stayed alert, constantly keeping an eye on the shelter, and Max, who seemed unaware of the mounting tension around him, continued to bring joy and comfort to those who visited. But as they navigated this new obstacle, their focus on honoring Edward's memory never wavered. They moved forward with their plans to research the feasibility of a mobile veterinary clinic. The idea, inspired by Edward's desire to help both people and animals, brought new hope to Thomas and Clara. The thought of carrying on Edward's legacy in such a meaningful way lifted their spirits, despite the challenges they now faced. As the investigation into the note continued, and the mobile clinic plan took shape, Thomas began to realize that Edward's impact was much greater than he had ever imagined. Max was not only a symbol of Edward's love for animals, but also a testament to the kind of man Edward had been, someone who had quietly worked behind the scenes to help others, often without recognition. Despite the uncertainties and the hurdles, Thomas knew he was on the right path. The bond between him, Clara, and Max had grown deeper, and in honoring Edward's memory, they were not only helping animals in need, but also healing themselves. It was a journey that no longer felt like a duty, but rather a continuation of something far more significant, a legacy of compassion, love, and understanding. But her words carried a deep, unresolved pain. Clara, standing beside Thomas, felt a rush of conflicting emotions. She had hoped the event would be a moment of uniting the community around Edward's legacy, but now, this unexpected visitor had introduced a new layer of complexity. Samantha continued, her voice softer now. "I don't want to take Max away, but I need you to know that he wasn't just adopted by Edward. He was part of our family too. We had him for a long time before he went to Edward." Her eyes seemed to search Thomas's for some sign of understanding. "It's not about ownership, it's about the love we had for him. I just need to say that." Thomas was quiet for a moment, processing her words. He felt a twinge of sympathy for Samantha. He understood what it meant to lose a beloved pet, to have your heart broken by the circumstances that led to separation. But Max had been with Edward for so long, and it was clear from his attachment to Edward that Max was his dog in every sense of the word. "I can't imagine what that was like for you," Thomas said softly, his voice full of empathy. "But Max has been with Edward for years, and Edward loved him like family. I'm not here to diminish what you and your family went through, but Max has found his place with us. He's been through so much, and we're doing everything we can to honor Edward's memory." Samantha looked down, her expression wavering. "I get that," she said quietly. "I do. But sometimes it feels like Max's story is being rewritten, and we're just left in the margins." Clara stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "This isn't about rewriting anything, Samantha. It's about honoring the truth, Edward's truth, Max's truth. Edward had a vision, and we're doing our best to see it through. But none of this is meant to erase the past. We just want to ensure Max's future, in a way that honors all the love he's received." There was a long pause. Samantha seemed to be grappling with her own emotions, torn between the love she had for Max and the reality of how far he had come from the family she had once known. Finally, she nodded, though her eyes still held a trace of sadness. "I understand," she whispered. "I didn't mean to disrupt everything. I just needed you to hear me." Max deserves all the love in the world, and I can see that he's gotten it here." With that, Samantha turned and walked away, leaving Thomas and Clara to digest the weight of her words. The room, still humming with the buzz of conversations and the success of the event, felt quieter now, the air heavier with a reminder of Max's complicated history. Clara sighed and glanced at Thomas. "That was unexpected." "It was," Thomas agreed, feeling a sense of conflict settle over him. "I just wanted to honor Edward's dream, and now this. It's just a lot." Max, sensing the tension, padded over to Thomas, nudging his leg gently. Thomas reached down to scratch behind his ears, the simple gesture grounding him. "We'll figure this out," Clara said, her tone resolute. "What matters is Max's well-being and Edward's legacy. We can't let anything derail that." Thomas nodded, his gaze lingering on Max. The little dog, completely unaware of the complexities swirling around him, wagged his tail and looked up at Thomas with unwavering trust. In that moment, Thomas knew the path forward wouldn't be easy, but he also knew that Max was more than just a symbol or a story. He was a living testament to the love and compassion that Edward had spread, and as long as Thomas and Clara had him, they would protect him with everything they had. As the event came to a close, the sense of renewed hope and purpose lingered. Donations had been raised, partnerships with local businesses had been secured, and the dream of the mobile veterinary clinic seemed more achievable than ever. Yet, the challenges were far from over. Max's story had touched many, but it had also unearthed old wounds. Thomas and Clara were no longer just fighting to preserve Edward's legacy. They were now battling to protect Max's future and the truth of his journey. But Thomas and Clara refused to back down. The events of the past months had strengthened their resolve, and with the support of the community, and now Samantha, they were more determined than ever to honor Edward's legacy through the mobile clinic. The launch event was meticulously planned. Clara worked tirelessly to organize every detail, ensuring that it would be an inspiring celebration of Edward's dream. The day arrived, and the shelter buzzed with excitement. Local businesses, veterinarians, animal lovers, and community members gathered, eager to see the clinic in action. As guests filtered in, the energy was palpable. Volunteers from the veterinary college mingled with donors, discussing how they could further contribute to the clinic's mission. It felt like the culmination of everything they had worked for. The mobile clinic was no longer just an idea, but a tangible project that could change lives. Max, of course, was front and center, his gentle presence the perfect symbol of the journey that had brought them all together. His story, which had sparked so much conflict, was now a testament to the power of community, love, and perseverance. He greeted every guest with a wag of his tail, as though to remind everyone that his journey was one of resilience and belonging. When it was time for Thomas to speak, he stood before the crowd, his heart swelling with pride. The memories of the months of turmoil and uncertainty faded as he focused on the present moment, surrounded by people who believed in the cause. "Edward had a vision," Thomas began, his voice strong and clear. "A vision where no animal, no matter how small or how far, was left behind. He believed that every creature, every person, deserved the opportunity for a second chance. This clinic is a step toward making that vision a reality, and I am honored to stand before you today with a community that shares that belief." The crowd erupted in applause, but Thomas's gaze was fixed on Max, who sat calmly at his feet. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the journey they had all taken together. Clara joined him at the podium, her voice equally steady. "This is not just about a mobile clinic. It's about the relationships we build with the animals we care for and with each other. Edward believed in connection, in compassion, and in giving back. That's the legacy we're carrying forward today." As the speeches concluded, the event shifted to a celebration of the work ahead. People walked through the shelter, examining the van that would serve as the mobile clinic, talking to volunteers, and learning more about the services it would provide. Local businesses had donated everything from medical supplies to snacks for the volunteers, and the entire day was a beautiful reminder of the strength of the community. Yet, despite the overwhelming success of the launch, the lingering effects of Gerald's campaign were still felt. The media's portrayal of the clinic's origins remained a sensitive subject, and there were still those who questioned the transparency of the organization. Anonymous threats continued, though they had become less frequent, and there were occasional whispers of doubt. Thomas and Clara knew that they would have to work harder than ever to rebuild trust. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but they were resolute. They had Max, they had the community, and they had Edward's dream to guide them. Samantha, who had been quietly watching from the back, approached them after the speeches. She smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice a little shaky with emotion, "for allowing me to be part of this. I never thought I'd be standing here, supporting Max's future with people who truly care about him. You've shown me what it means to fight for something that matters." Thomas and Clara exchanged a look, their bond with Samantha now stronger than ever. "Thank you," Clara said, "for being here and for sharing Max's story with us. He's a part of all of us now." As the event wound down, the sense of renewal was palpable. The mobile clinic was officially launched, and while the battle for Max's legacy wasn't over, they had won the most important fight, ensuring that the clinic would become a real, lasting resource for animals and people alike. That night, as Thomas and Clara sat together in the shelter's office, Max resting at their feet, they allowed themselves a rare moment of peace. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like they were on the right path. "Edward would be proud," Clara said quietly, looking down at Max, who looked up at them with adoring eyes. Thomas smiled softly. "He would. And so are we." The future felt uncertain, but with the community behind them, and the strength of the bonds they had formed, they knew they were ready to face whatever came next. The mobile clinic, the dream Edward had started, was now a living, breathing reality, and they would continue to fight for it, for Max, and for all the animals and people whose lives it would touch. The spotlight on Thomas, Clara, and Max only grew brighter as the news segment aired. It wasn't just a story about a shelter or a mobile clinic anymore. It was a story of resilience, integrity, and the power of a community coming together for a common cause. The phone lines were flooded with calls from people wanting to help, donate, and volunteer. Local businesses and foundations offered to partner with them, and the shelter's social media pages exploded with positive messages. For the first time in a long while, Thomas and Clara felt a deep sense of relief. The smear campaign, which had cast such a long shadow over their work, was now in the past. Gerald's influence was fading, and in its place, they were witnessing the real strength of the community, a community that believed in their vision, believed in Edward's legacy, and believed in the mobile clinic as a beacon of hope for underserved populations. With each passing day, the clinic gained momentum. The first few trips were met with overwhelming gratitude from the communities it served. Local shelters, veterinary clinics, and families with limited access to veterinary care expressed their appreciation, with some sharing stories of how Max had inspired them to believe in second chances, not just for animals, but for themselves. As the clinic made its rounds, Thomas and Clara reflected on how far they had come. They thought back to the nights filled with uncertainty, the court hearings, and the emotional toll of defending Edward's legacy. But now, as they watched Max interact with the people they served, they knew it had all been worth it. However, the triumphs didn't stop there. As the mobile clinic's reach expanded, Thomas and Clara began to plan the next phase of their mission. They envisioned a network of mobile units that could serve multiple areas, reaching even more communities in need. The road ahead was still filled with challenges, but it felt like a journey they were no longer walking alone. One evening, as they sat on the shelter's porch with Max nestled between them, Clara turned to Thomas with a smile. I think Edward would be proud of how this turned out. He would have loved to see how much this clinic means to so many people. Thomas nodded, his heart full. He would have. And I think he'd be proud of how we honored his vision. But, I think he'd be even prouder of the fact that we did it together. With Max. With the community. Max let out a soft bark, as though in agreement, his eyes sparkling with affection. As they watched the sun set over the horizon, Thomas and Clara felt a profound sense of peace. They had overcome the greatest obstacles, and in doing so, had turned Edward's dream into something real, something that would continue to help countless animals and people for years to come. And through it all, they knew that Max, with his gentle presence and unwavering loyalty, had been the symbol of everything they had fought for: love, second chances, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. It was a new beginning, one that Edward would have been proud to see take shape, a future built on hope, resilience, and the shared mission of giving every animal the second chance they deserved. But victorious. They had navigated the treacherous waters, saved the frightened animals, and brought them to safety. The storm had passed, but the emotional and physical toll of the mission lingered. As the last of the rescued animals were loaded onto the mobile clinic, Clara stood by the van, looking out at the exhausted but proud team. "Is it always like this?" she asked softly, her voice hoarse from the stress of the night. Thomas glanced at her, his face drawn with fatigue but lit with a sense of accomplishment. "No. But moments like this, when we truly make a difference, it's worth it." Max, as if sensing the weight of the moment, sat down beside them, his eyes soft and understanding. It had been his presence, his calmness, that had steadied the team through the worst of it. He was their anchor, their living symbol of Edward's legacy, a constant reminder of why they did what they did. Samantha, too, appeared, wet and tired but smiling. "You guys did amazing. I think we saved every animal that needed us." Thomas nodded, his voice a little shaky but strong with resolve. "We couldn't have done it without you, Sam. You were the one who got us here." She waved him off. "We all did it together. But I have to admit, seeing Max in action, he really is something else." The sun was beginning to rise, casting a soft light over the flooded area as the final animals were secured and comforted in the mobile clinic. The operation had been dangerous, stressful, and exhausting, but the success felt like a turning point for the shelter. This was what they were meant to do. This was Edward's dream realized. As they drove back to the shelter, the gravity of the mission started to sink in. The storm and chemical spill had been an unforeseen crisis, one that could have spiraled into disaster if not for their quick thinking and the mobile clinic's readiness. But now, in its aftermath, the shelter and the clinic had proven their value in a way that was undeniable. At a debriefing later that morning, Clara spoke passionately to their team. "This is the moment we've been working toward. This is why the mobile clinic matters. We've shown everyone in this community that we're here to stay, no matter what comes our way." Max lay at their feet, his tired body resting but his eyes still bright. He seemed content, as though he understood the importance of what they had just achieved. But even as they celebrated the success of the mission, Thomas and Clara knew that their work was far from over. The storm may have subsided, but the path ahead was still filled with challenges. They had earned the trust of many, but the damage from Gerald Parker's smear campaign and the influence of his supporters would continue to linger. There were still hearts to win over, minds to change, and barriers to break down. However, in that moment, exhausted but fulfilled, they knew one thing for sure: they were not alone. They had each other, they had the community's support, and, most importantly, they had Max together. They could face whatever came next. Days passed, and the community responded with an outpouring of gratitude. Donations to the shelter surged, and local leaders, now witnessing firsthand the dedication and expertise of the team, began to offer their formal support. Policymakers who had once been resistant to the clinic's mission now spoke at town hall meetings in favor of expanding its reach. The mobile clinic became a symbol of hope, not just for the animals, but for the people who had witnessed the resilience of Thomas, Clara, and their team. Samantha, too, found herself more deeply involved, becoming a vocal advocate for the shelter and its mission. Her voice in the community had grown louder, and she was welcomed at every turn. The bond between her, Thomas, Clara, and Max had evolved into something unbreakable, a shared commitment to continue Edward's work, to keep the dream alive, and to honor the legacy of a man who had always believed in second chances. The storm that had tested them had also solidified their place in the community. No longer just a shelter and mobile clinic, they had become a symbol of what could be accomplished when people came together with compassion and determination. The journey wasn't over, but now, more than ever, they were ready for whatever came next. As Thomas sat with Clara one evening, watching the sunset from the porch, he turned to her with a smile. "You know, I think Edward would have been proud of us. We've done something real here." Clara looked over at Max, who was resting beside them, his body tired but his spirit strong. "I think you're right. And we're going to keep doing it, for as long as we can." Max lifted his head at the sound of his name, his eyes locking with Thomas's. It was as if he understood, and with a soft woof, he settled back down, ready for whatever challenges and triumphs tomorrow would bring. And so, the story of the shelter, the mobile clinic, and Max continued, ever evolving, but always rooted in love, hope, and the unbreakable bond that had been forged between people and animals, a bond that would endure for generations to come. But about embracing the opportunities that lay ahead. With the invitation from the National Animal Welfare Organization, Thomas and Clara saw a chance to amplify Edward's legacy and the mission they had worked so tirelessly to build. This initiative could provide them with the resources and connections they needed to extend the reach of the mobile clinic even further into underserved areas, offering care to more animals and providing greater support to the communities in need. As Clara read the message aloud once more, she felt a wave of excitement and determination. This was the next chapter, the chance to turn their hard-won success into a larger movement, impacting even more lives. "This is it, Thomas," Clara said, her voice steady with conviction. "This is the opportunity we've been waiting for. We can take everything we've built and share it with even more people." Thomas nodded, his eyes reflecting the same excitement. "It's incredible. We've worked so hard to get here, and now we have the chance to help more animals and families. Edward would be proud." Max, sensing the change in the air, lifted his head once more and gave a soft woof, as though offering his own silent approval. He had been with them through every challenge, every triumph, and now, as they looked ahead to this new chapter, his unwavering presence was a constant reminder of everything they had accomplished. That evening, as the shelter grew quieter and the sky darkened, Thomas and Clara sat side by side, reflecting on how far they had come. The shelter was more than just a place of rescue now. It had become a symbol of hope, resilience, and community. They had faced the storm and emerged stronger, and now they were poised to face whatever new challenges and opportunities the future would bring. "We've built something amazing here," Clara said softly, her hand resting gently on Max's head. "But it's only the beginning. There's so much more we can do. So many more animals to save." Thomas looked out at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, feeling the weight of the journey they had taken and the road still ahead. "And we will. Together. As long as we stay true to Edward's dream, there's no limit to what we can accomplish." Max let out a contented sigh, resting his head on Clara's lap as the three of them sat in the quiet of the night, knowing that their journey was far from over. With the promise of new partnerships, new challenges, and new lives to save, the future felt bright and full of possibilities. As the sound of distant laughter and voices from the shelter's courtyard faded into the background, Thomas, Clara, and Max found peace in knowing that their hard work had created something lasting. The shelter was more than just a place. It was a beacon of hope, a sanctuary for both animals and people, a reflection of the strength and compassion that had been with them from the very start. And as they prepared to step into this next chapter, they did so with the unwavering belief that, no matter the obstacles ahead, they would face them together, united by their love for animals, their community, and the enduring spirit of Edward's dream. "We really have," he said, his gaze drifting over the bustling shelter grounds, the sounds of activity reminding him of just how much they had accomplished. "It feels like just yesterday we were struggling to keep the doors open, and now, look at all this. Edward's dream. It's becoming a reality in ways we never imagined." Clara smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It's not just Edward's dream anymore," she said softly, looking around at the volunteers, the children, the families who had become part of their extended family. "It's our dream, all of ours. And Max, he's the heart of it all." Max raised his head at the sound of his name, giving them a gentle wag of his tail before lowering his head back to his paws. It was as if he knew that, in his own way, he had been the catalyst for so many lives changing for the better. His quiet strength had brought together a community, inspired a movement, and reminded people of the power of compassion, even in the face of adversity. "You're right," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's more than just a dog. He's a reminder that in our darkest moments we can find the strength to keep going." Clara nodded, the evening sky casting a golden hue over them. "Max brought us together, and now he's helping us do so much more than we ever thought possible." Their conversation paused for a moment as the sounds of the shelter's busy evening filled the air, a chorus of wagging tails, laughter, and the steady murmur of voices. It was a comforting sound, one that represented all that they had achieved. But even as they celebrated their success, they both knew there was more to be done. In the months that followed, their work continued to evolve. With the increased attention, funding, and volunteer support, the shelter had become a central hub for animal welfare in the region. New partnerships formed, including collaborations with veterinary schools that brought in expert volunteers to assist with medical care and spaying/neutering programs. Clara's school initiative took off, with Max as the beloved mascot. The program reached hundreds of students, teaching them not only about the responsibility of pet ownership, but also about empathy and kindness. The children, inspired by Max's story, began organizing their own community service projects, raising funds and awareness for the shelter. Meanwhile, Thomas worked tirelessly to expand their mobile clinic's reach, ensuring that no animal, no matter how remote, would go without care. With a larger team and more resources, they managed to bring veterinary services to rural communities that had long been underserved, saving countless animals from neglect and abandonment. Even amid their growing success, the shadow of Gerald Parker occasionally reared its head. Though his influence had diminished, the remnants of his smear campaign still lingered in some corners of the community. Yet, Thomas and Clara stood firm. With each new success, each new animal saved, they silenced the doubters, proving that their mission was one of integrity, love, and selflessness. One late evening, as they sat in the quiet of the shelter after another long day of work, Clara turned to Thomas, a soft smile on her face. "Do you ever think about how far we've come? From the day we decided to keep Edward's dream alive to now, it's like we've built something we never could have imagined." Thomas sat back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I do think about it," he said quietly, "every single day. And I think about how lucky we are to be part of something so much bigger than ourselves. But what keeps me going, Clara, is knowing that there are so many more lives we can touch, so many more animals we can save. Edward's dream is just the beginning." Clara reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm so grateful for you, Thomas, and for everything we've built here. For Max. For Edward." Thomas smiled, his heart full. "And for all of us, Clara. Together, we've created something beautiful." And this is just the start. As the night deepened, they sat there in peaceful silence, the gentle sounds of the shelter's life continuing in the background. They knew there would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome. But with their community behind them, and with Max always at their side, they were ready to face whatever came next, together. As the final words of their journey echoed in the hearts of everyone who had followed their story, a sense of calm and fulfillment settled over the shelter. Edward's Haven, a place that had once seemed like an impossible dream, was now a symbol of everything they had achieved, through determination, love, and community. Thomas, Clara, and Max, forever linked to the spirit of Edward's vision, stood as living proof of how one person's dream, when nurtured by the right hands, could change the world. And with each new day, they continued to inspire others, their work touching lives and giving hope to those who had nowhere else to turn. And so, the story of Edward's Haven didn't end. It evolved. With every life saved, every lesson learned, and every heart touched, they built a legacy of compassion, a legacy that would ripple out, touching countless others for years to come. And just as they had done from the beginning, they carried forward with Max leading the way, reminding everyone that, no matter the odds, the power of love, hope, and unity could overcome anything. The end. For now. Thank you for following the incredible journey of Thomas, Clara, and Max. Their story is a testament to what can be achieved when we work together, fueled by a passion to make the world a better place. If you've been touched by their journey, join us in making a difference, and stay tuned for more heartwarming stories that inspire courage, resilience, and hope.